All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Brianna Mosher, Executive Director of Flint Genesee Education and Talent, and we are very excited to have you for this webinar on minimum wage and earned sick time changes. So much has changed since we last came together, but important to make sure that you guys are having all of your questions answered and up to date on exactly what is current. I'm going to hand it over to Andy in just a second to introduce our speaker, but before I do, I just want to send a quick reminder to let you all know that this meeting is being recorded, and we will send out a copy of that following today's presentation. Again, as a reminder, everyone came in on mute, and we ask that you please stay on mute throughout the duration of this webinar. If you have questions, comments at any time, please feel free to drop them in the chat. We will have time to address them at the end of today's presentation. With that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Andy to kick us off.
Thank you, Bree, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. I'm Andy Younger. I'm the Executive Director of the Flint and Genesee Chamber, and I just want to reiterate what Bree said about being so glad that that you are here to learn more about how to implement Michigan's newly enacted earned sick time and minimum wage laws that are going to impact all employers throughout our state. And today we are so fortunate to have with us Sean Egan, who is the Deputy Director of Labor for the Michigan Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity. And this department, affectionately referred to as LEO, is the state agency tasked with helping employers understand what these laws dictate, and that agency is also in charge of enforcing these new rules. And today, Sean will be able to provide much more specific and accurate information than what was shared during our last webinar, if you were able to join us. Because that webinar took place prior to us knowing the specific language and directives in the current law. And on this topic, Sean is, without a doubt, the right person for us to hear today. Sean brings a wealth of experience across all areas of our economy. After serving in the U.S. Navy, he apprenticed and became a journeyman electrician through the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. And in 2007, Sean was elected by his fellow members as the head of the local union representing construction electricians, manufacturing, broadcasting, and electrical motor service industries. His duties included managing the operations and representational activities for members. And while working full-time, Sean earned his bachelor's degree in business administration with a concentration in finance from Davenport University, and then went on to earn a JD from the Thomas Cooley Law School, going to classes during weekends and at nights. So today at LEO, Sean's focus is primarily overseeing MIOSHA, the Workers' Disability and Compensation Agency, the Bureau of Employment Relations, and the Wage and Hour Division. He also supports LEO's efforts across the spectrum as his experience spans many of the agency's goals. We are so fortunate to have Sean today with us as part of our ongoing effort to keep chamber members and employers throughout the county informed about these laws and how to best prepare in a way that minimizes disruption to your operations and your financial position. And these types of presentations and resources are brought to you thanks to the close partnership that the Chamber has with our sister divisions at the Flint and Genesee Group, which include the Flint and Genesee Economic Alliance, Explore Flint and Genesee, and the Flint and Genesee Education and Talent Division, as well as our government relations partner, Kelly Cawthorn. I'd also like to take a quick moment to thank those of you who are current Flint and Genesee Chamber members, since your membership makes it possible for us to work on your behalf at the local, the state, and the federal level to create opportunities for your businesses' sustainability, growth, and success. And with that, I am so pleased to give the floor to LEO Deputy Director Sean Egan. Sean, take it away.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you all for joining us during your lunch hour. Hopefully, you feel free to eat while you're paying attention to me, but I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all. If you've been joining us for our LEO stuff, it'll be sort of redundant for you. If you see me around anywhere with ESTA, it'll be sort of redundant for you. But one of the primary goals today, of course, is to try to answer questions that you have. So the slides, pretty straightforward. All of this is posted. If you go michigan.gov/wage hour, you'll find prior presentations, the slides that I'm sharing with you today. We have an updated FAQ I'll talk about just a little bit. and then some other information. That's where we're going to continually try to update and post there. If you've been trying to email us directly at Wage and Hour, I have to tell you, we are, no surprise, completely swamped. We are trying to get through all of those emails as quickly as we can, but they're coming in so quickly, it's hard for us. So if you emailed us there and got the auto response, we still have your email in the queue, but we're definitely digging through a pile. Most of the questions are answered in the FAQ. We tried to simplify with our update. So if you take a look at that now, it's posted as a PDF, it's numbered. There's no really about faces there from what we were saying previously. We're just trying to add examples, clarify some language. We had a couple of holdovers from some Paid Medical Leave Act language that was in the previous law that we had to take care of. But quite simply, you're all very well aware of the news about the 11th hour, literally in the evening on February 20th. The legislature passed changes to both the minimum wage law as well as the Earned Sick Time Act, effective immediately. So that means in Michigan law, that was effective when the governor signed. There's a slight gap in the minimum wage coverage. I won't talk about too much, but happy to answer that question. But both of those became effective on February 21, 2024. They did not change any effective dates other than one, which I'll cover on employee notice requirements. So just real quick, and I'll cover kind of who's covered and when, but the law now under ESTA makes it clear that sort of the accrual method is the primary method, and I'll talk about front loading in just a minute. But what that basically is depending on the size of your business, if you're 10 or fewer, then it's different than it is for 11 or more. That's the only distinction in employers there that is really covered. And every employee, regardless of size, would accrue 1 hour of earned sick time for every 30 hours worked. I think for employers, we're used to pay periods, we're used to prorating. There's no requirement to prorate the leave in the law. You can do that, but theoretically, every time you hit 30 hours, another hour shows up. If you want to make that, if you're working 40 hours, 1.22, whatever it is, you can do that as long as the math equals that 1 hour for every 30 hours worked. And keep that in mind, it's hours worked. So if you do holiday pay, vacation pay, when they're using ESTA, whatever, that's not hours worked. So that's not going to count toward that 30-hour requirement. Many of you already do that, but just clarifying that there too. The primary difference between the size of employers is how much the employer can limit. So if you read the law, if you're using this accrual method, there's no limit on the amount of time that an employee can accrue. There's a limit the employer can place on the use. So if you're using the accrual method, you may see that your employees accrued more than 40 or 72, depending on whether or not you're going to do that. But that's an employer choice to make that limit. You can go higher if you want, you just can't go lower. And then the 12-month period is whatever you say the 12-month period is. So some employers are using calendar years, some use fiscal years, some use anniversary dates for employees. So it's a 12-month period per employee. It is not like the Family Medical Leave Act where it's like the same for everybody. You can use different situations depending on how you're set up, but that 12-month period will be established by the employer. And importantly, in the law, it creates this new higher waiting period. It's called a waiting period, specifically in some of the information the legislature put out. And it's clear in the statute that applies if you're using the accrual method. If you're front loading, I'll talk about front loading in a moment, but front loading is available for immediate use. You can prorate that, but it's important to make that distinction. Employees, if you're using this 120-day period as a waiting period, they still accrue time. They just can't use it. So on that 121st day, if you're using the accrual method, whatever they've accrued before that is immediately available. They don't start accruing after that date. And then we can get into some questions around the 2-month, 120 days and 2 months reemployment and all that kind of stuff. I think we have a couple FAQs on that. And then small businesses in particular, if you're in that 10 or fewer framework, I don't know if anybody on the call is, but if you're in that 10 or fewer, you have until October 1, 2025 to comply. And then there's a very peculiar but important sort of 3-year rolling compliance metric for employers only if you're 10 or fewer for new businesses. The statute actually references February 21 of 2022. So if you started, in 2024 and you're in that 10 or fewer, your compliance date's actually going to be a couple years later than October 1, 2025. Happy to take questions on that. It's more straightforward than it sounds, but basically if I started a new business today and I'm less than 10 employees, I wouldn't have to comply until March 17th of 2028 with that, unless I break over that 10 employee threshold. Front loading clearly established in the law. I still get a lot of questions from employers on front loading that want to front load. If you do front load, you don't have to do much else. You don't have to allow carryovers. You don't have to track the hours that employees are working. If you're a large employer, it's 72 upfront, or if you're small, it's 40, and then you're kind of done. You do need some record keeping there to show that you've credited the hours, that you've allowed them to be used, that if you've denied those, why you denied those. If you think of it in terms of what types of complaints are we going to be receiving and what kind of records, that's the way we have to think about it, right? Is that employee's going to send us a complaint a year after the fact saying, hey, my employer didn't let me use earned sick time on such and such a date. We're going to ask the employer if they requested it, if you denied it, why did you deny it? And you're going to want to keep those kind of records. But for front loading, you don't have to track anything else. So you don't have to track the amount of hours worked unless you get to this front loading of part-time employees. This is a good tool, but a little bit complicated. But if you hire a new employee, they're going to be part-time. You want to front load the benefits. You can guesstimate how many hours you're hiring them for. So if you said, I'm hiring you for 20 hours a week, I'm going to front load 36 hours. If you're doing that for part-time employees, and this would largely only apply to hourly employees, because if you're salarying, if somebody's on salary, you can salary at 20 hours and just give them the 36 and you're not tracking anything anymore. But if they are hourly employees and you say, I think you're going to work about 20, I'm going to give you 36 hours, the employer is going to have to pay attention to how many hours they're actually working and then do what everybody's referring to as a true up. I think even the statute might say true up. But if I hire you for 20, you're working more than 20 regularly, the employer is going to have to add time to that front loaded benefit. Now, if you're using the accrual method, none of that applies. You're paying attention to how it's worked and all that kind of stuff. But on the front loading piece, you can clearly front load part-timers. You just have to give them a written notice that says, hey, I'm giving you 36 hours because I hired you at 20 hours. That's how many hours you expect you to work. And every once in a while, you're going to have to add more time if it turns out they're working 22 or 25 or 28. Or maybe even higher than that, and just make sure that that bank approximates what they would have accrued if you're using the accrual method. I probably made that sound much more difficult than it needs to be, but the gist is you're hiring somebody full-time, you want to front load, you can absolutely do that. It's available for immediate use. It's based on that 72 or 40 hours, depending on your size. You can prorate that to the 12-month period. So if you're a calendar year, for example, and you hire me in June, you don't have to front load me 72 hours. You can front load me 36 because I'm halfway through the year. But if you do part-time employees, you can front load, but you got to make sure that they would not have accrued more time. You can definitely put it into PTO policies. So this is one of the big questions that we get from employers. Law makes it very clear if you have an existing PTO policy, you can use that for ESTA purposes as long as it meets or exceeds the same amount of leave. And it can be used for the same purposes. So my experience with employer PTO policies is where you might have to make some modification on some of your notice language. So if you've used PTO for a while and it says, hey, you got to give us a week's advance notice, that wouldn't meet up with ESTA, right? So for at least those 72 hours, you're going to have to allow a different type of notice. We'll talk about notice a little bit more because the law did change what employers could do there, but you can use that PTO policy. So if, for example, you provide 80 hours of PTO right now, and you say, we're going to use that 80 hours to comply with ESTA, as long as your policy allows at least 72 of those for large, 40 for small, to be used for ESTA purposes, you're in compliance. And if I am covered by that 80 hours of PTO and I decide I'm going to Hawaii for 2 weeks, there's no ESTA left. The employer's not going to have to add more earned sick time hours or anything else to that PTO policy. It's a big frustration for workers out there that we've heard from them is that many employers are doing that and they thought that or presumed that they would get additional 72 hours, but you don't have to do that. The law doesn't require them. So if you fit it all into the same PTO policy, as long as it meets that total leave and can be used for the same purposes, you're going to be in compliance with the act. Hourly rate was clarified in the statute as well to basically it's your normal hourly rate. And we use the word normal or base. So base rate is as an electrician, I make $25 an hour. I get fringe benefits and other stuff added on to that. It's only that $25 an hour. We say the rate, the words normal hourly rate for workers, and I was never one of these, but they exist, that might do different tasks and receive a different hourly rate depending on what they were doing. We do see this on construction sites sometimes and other types of employers where, on Monday, Sean's the janitor, he's making X. On Tuesday, he's in the kitchen, he's making X. And they're not always the same. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. Our presumption is that I would qualify for ESTA based on whatever time I am missing. So if on Monday I make more than Tuesday, I may take Monday off, then I'm getting paid whatever that rate would be for Monday. For commission, piece rate, tipped workers, it's just the full minimum wage. Unless you have some kind of different arrangement with your folks where you say it's 15 bucks an hour or the piece rate, then it's 15 bucks an hour, it's 15 bucks an hour commission, then 15 bucks an hour. But generally for those kind of variable employees, it's going to be the full minimum wage or their normal hourly rate or base rate. There is no private right of action in law anymore. Any complaint comes to the Department of Labor and we'll handle those. And then on the increments, they made it clear that the employer, this is an employer choice. You can go 1 hour for use or less. That's up to you. So you can't do more. You can't say, hey, you have to use earned sick time in 2-hour increments, but you can go up to an hour or less if you choose to go less. Some employers, however you cover your time, maintain absences, you can go lower, just can't go higher than that 1 hour increment. Every employer in Michigan is covered except for United States government, and we found one federal preemption issue related to railway workers that are covered by the Railway Unemployment Insurance Act. If any of those are on the call, you probably know who you are, so I won't spend much time on that. And then the small employer piece is rolling. So if your business is over 3 years old, it's October 1, 2025. If it's less than 3 years old and you're less than 10 people, it may be after October 1, 2025. We have some good FAQs and examples around that. I think the bigger questions we've been getting from employers are, how do you count employees? So it's any employee that you have in the United States or its territories. We do that for other statutes too, so that's not just for this one. If you're a small business right on the cusp, there's like a 20 work week thing. We can spend more time on that if you choose to. But we've been getting more questions about these employee exemptions that are included in the act. These would still count for your total number of employees. What they're exempted from is coverage under the act. So they still count as an employee exempted from coverage under the act. It's relatively limited. So you have unpaid, not counting the United States government. The United States government as an employee, the United States government as employees are exempted from this act. Unpaid trainees or unpaid interns, no big surprise there. If you're unpaid, there's nothing to pay you, right? Individuals employed in accordance with the Youth Employment Standards Act, so YESA. If you read that act, that means they have a valid work permit. There are certain ages, they're working the right hours, but there are some exemptions from the Youth Employment Standards Act. If you meet one of those and you're in compliance with the act, they're not going to be covered under ESTA. And then finally, the big one that we get a lot of questions on is what the heck does this mean? This exemption for workers that schedule their own hours and the employer's policy prohibits the employer from taking any adverse personnel action against them. That is a very narrow exception. The legislature, when they were working on that language, kept talking to me about highly compensated folks like a surgeon that technically works for the hospital but runs their own practice. We don't know how to come up with a good example for this, but the bottom line sort of is that regardless of how flexible you are in scheduling, if the employer owns the schedule, the employee is not exempted from this act. So some of the questions there are about substitute teachers, adjunct professors, some other classifications like that, where they're pretty generous on kind of signing up for shifts. But if the employer owns the shift, then the way one of our investigators put it is, if I can't sign up to work midnight to 5 because that works best for me, then the employer still owns the shift. So that exemption is very, very narrow. It's not about flexible scheduling policies. And then finally, we always do put in here, and we're talking with the municipal league tomorrow for any of you that are tied into your local municipalities. Public officials, appointed commissions, even if they receive a stipend or some kind of payment, are not considered employees. So they won't meet the definition of an employee. I'm gonna skip these couple. We can get into the 20 work week threshold if you want, but basically, if you're 9 employees most of the year, but during that calendar year or your 12-month period, you hit 11 or more, that could be temporary employees that you hire for seasonal work, it could be whatever. According to the law, are basically considered 11 or more for the remainder of that 12-month period and the following 12-month period, even if you shrink back down to 9 or 10 or fewer. For all of your current employees, they began accruing time on February 21, 2025, unless you meet that small employer exemption. The 120 days, none of that stuff applies to existing employees as of that date. It is only for employees hired on or after February 21, 2025, depending on what system you're using. This is the only sort of timeline in ESTA that changed, and it's related to the notice that employers have to give to their employees. So we're running up close to the state. The statute's very specific on what you have to give the employees. So we've recently updated our FAQ, and it's these bullet points: the amount of earned sick time that they're required to be provided under the Act, the employer's choice of how to calculate the 12-month period, how it may be used, the fact that the employer can't retaliate against an employee for using the Act, and then that the employee has a right to file a complaint with the department for any violation of the Act. The remaining 2 bullets on there are just notes to everybody. If you have a significant percentage of your workforce that are non-English speakers or English as a second language, if it hits 10% or more, you have to give this notice in that language as well. What we encourage employers to do is for posters and other things, we do translations. Just, if you're in doubt, download the poster in another language that you might think fits and just post that one there too. All of the posters and everything are updated on our website that I mentioned earlier. And then I won't spend too much time on this, but the legislature changed language on how this applies to current collective bargaining agreements. So if that applies to you, then if you've already negotiated sick leave benefits of any kind, even if they're less than, and it's already in your contract, and your contract doesn't expire for another year or so, you would have to be in compliance with ESTA whenever that contract gets renewed. If your contract's silent, doesn't say a word about sick leave benefits or anything else, then it was February 21, 2025. I've just spent a moment on minimum wage, but the law as it was on February 21 was going to be $12.48 an hour for the full minimum wage. The law as it is on February 21, 2025 is $12.48 per hour for the full minimum wage. So that stayed the same for this first year, but it moves to 15 faster. So not getting into all the court decision, but it was down the road. So basically next January, you're going to see a notice from us around November saying that it's $13.73 for the full minimum wage. And then on January 1, 2027, it's $15 an hour for the full minimum wage. And then after that, it starts increasing with the CPI. They're going to use the Midwest CPI, so it's a little bit different than just if you just Google CPI. But so on January 1, 2028 and thereafter, that 15 is going to increase based on the consumer price index. The significant change in the minimum wage law was regarding tipped employees. So the original petition language phased out what's called a tip credit altogether. A tip credit works, all employers in Michigan, restaurants included, which is primarily where tipped workers are, have to pay $12.48 an hour. When you leave tips, the employer gets to take a credit against the tips that you've given against that $12.48 down to a floor of $4.74 an hour. So that first $8 or so of tips an employee receives every hour are really offsetting the minimum wage obligation. And they've changed that. So it's going to max out at half of the minimum wage. So you'll see that if you're in that space, we can talk about it more, but you'll see that as we kind of go forward. And then one thing about Michigan law, different from federal law, is federal law allows employers to make tip pooling mandatory under certain situations. Michigan law requires that it be voluntary on the part of the employee receiving tips. So we have some FAQs and different things we're doing in that space, and happy to talk about that if that relates to any of you, but certainly for today, we want to try to get to as many questions as we can. So I will do my best. We try to be consistent.
Yes, and we have a ton of questions coming in. I'm going to go ahead and just start from the top here. One of our attendees is looking for a little bit of guidance. They have 2 businesses who ESTA applies to. There has been ongoing transaction whereby the business will be sold, completely new ownership and new entities starting business venture with sellers existing. Oops, I just lost my existing business. Section 5 of ESTA addresses successor employer, but the act does not define. Would the act apply to the purchaser of the business as a successor, or would the purchase fall into the new business and have 3 years to comply?
More than likely with that example, it's successor. So successor is like not defined in ESTA, but it's defined in other case law, including the National Labor Relations Act and some other things, where it talks about how the business is transferred. So if you are a successor employer, in essence, I'm buying your business. We're not stopping anything. You can have people reapply and all that kind of stuff, but in essence, we're continuing the operation. More than likely, you're going to be considered a successor under ESTA. Now, we just got this question in today too about a slightly different situation where the business is just closing down and one of the employees is starting their own thing. And most of the employees are going to go over with that new thing, no financial stuff, changing hands, whatever else. Don't know the entire example. That might be one where it's not a successor, but what you're really looking for there is, in essence, while ownership changed, the business just kept on trucking. Is when you're going to see a successor.
Okay. Another question here: if front loading, does it renew in February or the calendar year?
If so, it depends on what the 12-month period is that the employer is using. So I think I caught that question correctly, Brianna, but in essence, if let's say you're going calendar year, then you can prorate from February 21 through the end of the year. If you're going September to September, you can prorate from February 21 to September, right? So you can do what you need to do to line up with your calendar year. And then I think moving forward, the same would be true with new hires that come in during that 12-month period.
Okay, and another question here on front loading for clarification. Can you front load for full-time employees and accrue for part-time?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the only kind of advice we give employers, and we've heard, we're going to front load for salary, accrue for hourly, whatever, and that's all fine. I think the only advice I give employers is within employee groups, I would probably treat them all the same, and that's not really anything to do with ESTA. It's to avoid unintentionally becoming discriminatory and somebody having a discrimination complaint.
Gotcha. If we have 2 buckets, ESTA and vacation, and we front load and the employee doesn't use all of their ESTA time, can we carry it over to vacation time?
Yeah, as long with carryover payouts, those kinds of things, employers have a lot of latitude to figure out how they might move those back and forth. So if you front load that ESTA bank at 72, you get to the end of the year, just remember you're going to be adding 72 to ESTA at the new year if you're front loading. But certainly an employer can pay out that. They don't have to. Law doesn't say they have to. Let's make it clear. You don't have to. But an employer can do that. You could carry it over to some kind of other PTO bank. You could do a number of things with it.
Okay. Another interesting example here. If we are hiring using temporary agencies, do we honor their time with the agencies towards ESTA, or I'm sorry, towards the 120 days, or does that time reset when they are hired to the company?
Yeah, all we're going to look at is who the employer is. So I believe it would reset. Now, certainly an employer could honor that time, and theoretically you may want to, for that might be part of them coming over at all, right? But under the statute, all we're going to look at is who is the employer.
Okay. And it looks like a little bit of an exemption question here. Does the PTO ESTA requirements also apply to seasonal employees, including summer interns? So I know after this question came in, you spoke about the unpaid interns, but can you talk a little bit about where seasonal and temporary employees fall within that?
They definitely are covered. They definitely will accrue time. It's really that 120-day piece that may limit them from actually being able to use that. The employer could, so you're going to be tracking, you're going to be doing record keeping for the amount of hours they work. But they may not get to a position where they use that. Now, once that summer is over, or any seasonal or any kind of any employee, honestly, if they are less than 120 days or more, and you separate from employment, so you're not carrying them as an employee or anything else, not an unpaid leave, and they're still an employee or something, for more than 2 months, if they come back within 2 months, all that bank is still there.
Mm-hmm.
More than 2 months, all of that is gone.
Gotcha. Okay, if we decide to front load, does it start fresh or does time taken between January and now count against it?
So for us, in wage and hour, we can only enforce the law from February 21 looking forward. So if you front loaded 72 on January 1 and somebody used 30 in January, all we're going to be able to take a look at is from February 21 moving forward. So while I don't know that any of us love this answer specifically, an employer may need to add time back for somebody that might have used some between January and February 21, because that's not anything that we can do with that.
Yeah, and that's for this year only, so then
Yeah.
in the following year it would reset. Okay, Maddie here is asking if an employee works 4 10-hour days instead of 5 8-hour days, can/should the employer pay the full 10 hours of ESTA or just 8 hours?
It would be the full 10. So even on an overtime day, so we talk about construction quite a bit. So like Saturdays often overtime, Sundays often overtime. So they can use ESTA on those overtime days. It's for scheduled time though. So if they use it on that day, it's still the straight time hourly rate. So if you're doing 4 10s, it would be for that shift.
Okay. General question here, do they plan to increase the amount of money you can make if you are on Social Security?
We wouldn't have anything to do with that. Certainly happy to help advocate though, but we wouldn't have anything to do with that.
Okay. And Lisa, if you're asking to anything specific, please feel free to drop clarification in the chat, or you can follow up with Sean directly afterwards. Danielle here is asking if we pay our office cleaning person a set amount each pay through payroll, how does ESTA affect her? Is she now allowed to earn sick time?
It's if they're considered an employee. So I think if that's an independent subcontractor, that's not the employer's problem, right?
Mhm.
It's up to that independent subcontractor. But if you're basically salarying an employee for cleaning services, they would still be covered by minimum wage and all that kind of stuff. So whatever that amount is would need to meet that. If they're considered an employee, they would be covered under ESTA and would begin accruing time.
Okay. Jasmine here is asking, does ESTA explicitly state that it does not cover overtime hours, or is this a company choice? Some unions define overtime based on exceeding 40 hours per week rather than on a daily basis. If we have scheduled work for days at 10 hours per day for specific jobs, does ESTA not cover the additional 2 hours per day because it is considered overtime? And I think you kind of just spoke to that.
Yeah, the overtime issue in the law only deals with how much the individual is being paid. So they would be entitled to their straight time hourly rate for missing any potential scheduled hours if they're using the Earned Sick Time Act. So if you were working 16 hours a day, they presumably could use 16 hours, but it would be at their straight time normal hourly rate or base rate.
Gotcha. Can you speak to how ESTA applies to contractual employees?
There's a section in the law, if we're talking contractual with an employee individual employment contract, there's some language in the act about when that would apply. It's similar to what I talked about with the collective bargaining agreements, which we know applies more broadly. If it was signed before December 24th, if it doesn't conflict, if it conflicts with the act, and what the legislature was meaning by this word conflict is either in a collective bargaining agreement or an employment contract, you've already put in sick leave. So that's what they're talking about. If it doesn't have anything, then ESTA applies. And then if you're going to use that, the employers that have these, this is for independent individual employee contracts between the employer and the employee, not a handbook, something they signed, but an actual contract. You're supposed to notify the department of its existence. So if you have those, please check out our website, and we can certainly have some discussion about what you should be doing there. But I think the legislature presumed that rather than notify the department, many employers might just update their contracts, but there is a distinction between that, individual employment contract and collective bargaining agreements.
Okay, very good. And I did drop that link to the website in the chat. If you scroll up, I will also make sure that Andy has it to send back out with the recording of this presentation. Another question here, can PTO hours be used to offset ESTA hours?
See, as I kind of talked about during the presentation, I think you might, whoever asked that, if you want to dump in a little bit more, but you can use existing PTO plans to meet ESTA requirements as long as it has at least that 72 or 40 hours and they can be used for the same purposes. If your policy on PTO, like let's say you have ESTA in 2 different banks, and they're using up all their ESTA and you want to allow them to use PTO, you can certainly do all that kind of stuff. But the requirements of the Earned Sick Time Act are only going to apply to earned sick time hours.
Okay. Interesting question here. What tracking and reporting is required for an organization with unlimited PTO?
Yeah, so there's 2 things when you talk about unlimited PTO. So you could basically view that as front loading. So those record keeping requirements I mentioned, where you're not really tracking how many hours people would have accrued, how many hours they worked, or anything like that. But if we got a complaint that says, hey, they didn't let me use earned sick time, we're going to ask you about whether or not the employee requested it. And I think that's an important point I often overlook or speed through is, unlike the FMLA, which many people are used to, under earned sick time, the employee is requesting the use of the earned sick time hours. So if they just, whatever your policy is, if they just call in and they say, hey, I'm not coming in today, the employer shouldn't use earned sick time. But if they call in and say, hey, I'm using earned sick time hours, then that all applies. But for an unlimited PTO plan, treat it like front loading. Make sure you maintain records so that we can manage complaints that we receive if somebody used it and you denied it for some reason. And then I think that's probably the gist, but most unlimited PTO plans may or may not actually be unlimited, but for purposes of the Earned Sick Time Act, more than likely they're going to have more than 72 hours. So you can definitely use that, but you're going to want to watch out on some of those. If we get a complaint, what do we need to respond to?
Yeah. We have a question here that I think we spoke to a little bit. Can you front load and accrue time? So we gave the example of like part-time employees being front loaded, but part-time employees accruing. Luella, if you could just provide a little more information on what you're looking for specifically, and then Sean, if you have anything else to add to that, feel free. Another question here, how do we track on-call hours? I have employees that are on call for shifts if someone calls off. It is only if they do go in. So is it for the whole shift that they would be calculated for regardless if they are called into work?
It's 4 hours worked. So if you call somebody on call, now even though, so ESTA can be used for scheduled hours. And I think we have in the FAQ, if you're on call, once you're called in, theoretically, those became scheduled hours. So if somebody could use ESTA for those hours that they were called in for, but the earning or accrual is based on hours worked. So even though if I was called in to fill an 8-hour shift and I only worked 6, I'm only accruing ESTA for 6.
Gotcha. Okay, and it looks like our questions are wrapping up. So I did drop the link back in the chat. Feel free to continue to ask your questions. If you have them though, Luella did provide a little bit more information. So I want to go back to her question on front loading and accruing. So she's asking specifically in an example of front loading 40 hours and then accruing the remainder. Is that a policy that an organization could follow?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, it's really, the statute talks about the distinguishing between accrual and front loading.
Mhm.
And an employer sort of advancing time using the accrual method it's not going to be a violation, right? Because they have more time. All we would be looking for is that you meet the minimum requirements of the Earned Sick Time Act. So they're accruing 1 hour for every 30 hours worked. If you decide you're going to allow them to accrue one for every 10, that's not a violation. So because you're better than the statute. So if you're using the accrual method and you choose to like put in extra time, the only thing we advise employers on is because of that 120-day for new hires is it doesn't sound like this is a situation, but we've been asked, and I'll be blunt about the question, right? Can I use the accrual method for 120 days and then make everybody front loaded on 121, right? So I'm gonna kind of skirt the statute a little bit. That's probably gonna be a problem, but based on the question that was asked, the employer can certainly give time faster. They can allow them to accrue faster. They can allow broader use. As long as they're meeting those minimum requirements of the Earned Sick Time Act, they would be fine.
Okay. If we front load PTO, which includes sick time, how do we determine what is needed to be carried over in accordance to ESTA?
So if you're front loading as it comes to ESTA and you're putting it all in the same bank, if you're using front loading for ESTA, you don't have to carry over anything. So I think that's where one of those, if you choose to, as an employer, try to separate out the two, so we're only going to carry over PTO hours, not ESTA hours. I don't know how you actually draw that distinction, frankly, because I don't know that you're going to be tracking that closely. Because PTO is PTO, and if they take it for earned sick time, they take it for earned sick time. But for the front loaded earned sick time hours, you wouldn't have to carry anything over. Now, I don't have a good example or a good way to explain what you would do on the rest of your PTO policy, but that's going to be at your discretion.
Okay. And Kimberly here just wanted to be sure, if we front load, do we need to pay anyone for unused ESTA?
No, you can, but you don't need to.
Okay. All right, one last call for questions for anyone joining us. Sean, really appreciate you being here. Really appreciate all of the work that you guys have put into the website. There are a ton of resources there, and I think it's so great you're making yourself available to questions, because so many of these questions are nuanced and specific to the employer or organization. One question that we have had come up that I just want to bookend with, this does apply to nonprofit organizations as well, correct?
Correct.
Okay, that's something that has come up. Andy, any closing thoughts that you have as we wrap up today?
Not other than just want to share my gratitude to Sean for your willingness to jump in and engage with all of us and really help us as organizations and businesses in our area really prepare for how we're going to comply with these laws in a way that minimizes the disruption to our operations. Really appreciate that. As Bree had mentioned, we have a resource page specifically at the flintandgenesseechamber.org website. If you go to resources, it's one of the top menu items, earned sick time and minimum wage. And so we will include links to this webinar as well as any other updates, including links to the wage and hour website that Sean has been referencing, that the Michigan Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity has. That's probably going to be your best resource and most comprehensive, is that wage and hour webpage, and we want to encourage you to go to that. But and also on that, and Sean, I hope I can offer up you and your team, if there are some of those more nuanced, specific scenarios that people have questions about. It sounds like they're between the FAQ as well as just opportunities to chat with folks there. It sounds like you can get your questions answered.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful. And Bree, thank you so much. Great to have the Flint Genesee Education Talent Division as a key partner for all things related to leadership development, training, and capacity building for all of our organizations and businesses. So Bree, thank you for your partnership and leadership. And really appreciate everyone being on. And by all means, friends, whether you're a chamber member or not, we want you to be aware of these things. Tell any of your colleagues, any of your fellow business leaders to visit our website as well as the Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity wage and hour page as well.
Sounds good. Thanks, everyone.
All right, thanks everybody. And again, Sean, thank you so much.